Ellie Vance thought she was dying. Rejection had shattered her heart, and the fever was claiming her body. Alone in the middle of a torrential storm, she crawled onto the porch of a dilapidated cabin, begging for a single night of shelter. She thought she was speaking to a hermit, a rogue, a nobody. She looked into his steel-grey eyes and whispered, "I'm sick, I can't walk. Can I stay one night?" She had no idea that the man standing in the shadows wasn't a rogue. He was Dominic Blackwood, the ruthlessly powerful Alpha King who had been missing for 6 months. And by letting her in, he wasn't just saving a life. He was starting a war that would burn the werewolf world to the ground. Get ready for a story of betrayal, hidden identities, and a love that defies the pack laws. The rain didn't just fall, it punished. It lashed against the ancient pines of the Blackwood territory, turning the forest floor into a treacherous slurry of mud and decaying leaves. Ellie Vance stumbled, her knees finally giving way. She hit the wet earth hard, a gasp of pain tearing through her raw throat. She couldn't feel her fingers anymore. The wolfbane fever coursing through her veins was a fire that made her shiver uncontrollably. It was a cruel irony, burning up on the inside while freezing to death on the outside. She dragged herself upright, using the rough bark of a hemlock tree for support. She had been walking for 3 days since the rejection, since Mark, the alpha of the Silver Moon Pack, had publicly humiliated her, severed their bond, and cast her out as a rogue. "An Omega with no wolf is of no use to me," Mark had sneered. The memory stung worse than the freezing rain. Through the downpour, a faint yellow light flickered in the distance. It was a cabin. It looked abandoned, the wood grey and warping, the roof sagging under the weight of wet moss. But there was smoke curling from the chimney. Ellie pushed off the tree. Every step was a battle of will against biology. Her human body was failing. She needed warmth. She needed safety, even if it meant begging. She reached the porch, the wood creaking ominously under her slight weight. She collapsed against the door, her fist pounding feebly against the wood. "Help!" she croaked, her voice barely audible over the wind. "Please!" Silence answered her. She knocked again, harder this time, desperation lending her a fleeting strength. "Is anyone there? Please!" The door didn't open. Instead, it creaked inward just an inch, stopped by a heavy chain. A slice of darkness appeared, and from that darkness a pair of eyes stared out. They were the color of polished steel, cold and sharp enough to cut glass. "Go away," a deep voice rumbled. It wasn't a shout. It was a low growl that vibrated in Ellie's chest. It sounded like rocks grinding together deep underground. I have nowhere to go," Ellie stammered, clutching her soaking wet cardigan tighter around herself. Her teeth chattered so violently she bit her tongue. "I'm sick. I can't walk anymore. Can I stay one night?" The eye narrowed. The man behind the door seemed to be assessing her, sniffing the air subtly. He would smell the sickness on her, the metallic tang of the fever. He would smell the rain and the mud. But mostly, he would smell the absence of a pack. "This isn't a charity ward, girl. Keep moving. There's a town 10 miles south." "I won't make it 10 miles, Ellie whispered, sliding down the doorframe until she was sitting on the wet porch planks. Her vision blurred, grey spots dancing at the edges. "I won't make it 10 yards. Just the floor. Please, I'll leave at dawn." The silence stretched, heavy and tense. Inside the cabin, Dominic Blackwood tightened his grip on the door handle. He shouldn't let her in. He was in hiding for a reason. The coup that had nearly killed him 6 months ago was still fresh. His injuries had healed, but his strength hadn't fully returned. He was the Alpha King, the ruler of all packs on the continent, currently living like a fugitive in a shack while his beta, Silas, rooted out the traitors in the capital. If anyone found him, he was dead. But then the wind shifted, blowing her scent past the rot of the cabin. Beneath the sickness and the rain, there was something else. Lilac and ozone. It hit him like a physical blow to the solar plexus. Mate, his wolf, dormant and sulking for months, suddenly slammed against his ribcage, roaring with possessive fury. She is hurt, she is cold. Let her in. Dominic grit his teeth. A mate? Now? It was the worst possible timing. It was a death sentence for both of them. Please, she whimpered from the other side of the wood. The sound was fading, her energy spent. Dominic cursed under his breath, a vile, ancient curse. He undid the chain with a harsh rattle. He threw the door open. Ellie fell backward, expecting the support of the door to still be there. Dominic caught her before she hit the floorboards. His hands were large, rough, and incredibly warm. As he scooped her up, Ellie felt a jolt of electricity zap through her skin, shocking her out of her stupor for a brief second. She looked up. The man was massive. Even in the dim light of the fire, she could see the sharp jawline, the heavy stubble of a beard, and a scar that ran through his left eyebrow. He looked dangerous. He looked like violence barely contained in a human skin. But Ellie was too far gone to be afraid. She let her head loll against his chest. "Thank you," she breathed. "Don't thank me yet," Dominic grunted, kicking the door shut against the storm. "You survive the night, then you can thank me." Dominic carried her to the ragged sofa near the hearth. It was the only piece of furniture in the main room, aside from a wobbly table. He laid her down, and she immediately curled into a fetal position, shivering violently. He stood over her, his hands clenching and unclenching. The mate bond was screaming at him to comfort her, to strip the wet clothes off her, to warm her with his own body heat. He forced himself to take a step back. Control, he told himself. You are the king. You are not a slave to instinct. "What's your name?" he demanded, moving to the fireplace to stoke the dying embers. "Ellie," she whispered. "Ellie Vance." Vance. The name sounded familiar. A minor family in the Silver Moon pack. "You're a long way from Silver Moon territory, Ellie Vance," Dominic said, throwing a heavy log onto the fire. Sparks flew up the chimney. "What is a pack wolf doing out here alone in a storm?" "Not a pack wolf," she mumbled, her eyes squeezed shut. "Not anymore. Rejected." Dominic paused. Rejected? He looked back at her. She was small, delicate. She didn't look like a warrior, but she didn't look weak either. There was a stubborn set to her jaw even in sleep. "Who rejected you?" "Mark," she sighed, the name carrying a weight of sorrow. "Alpha Mark." Dominic's eyes darkened. Mark Thorne, an ambitious, cruel man who had been trying to expand his borders illegally for years. Dominic had planned to deal with him before the assassination attempt forced him into hiding. "He's a fool," Dominic said, his voice low. He turned back to her, realizing she had stopped shivering and was now starting to sweat. The fever was spiking. He walked over and placed the back of his hand against her forehead. She was burning up. "Wolfbane poisoning," he diagnosed instantly. It was a common tactic for weakening omegas to drive them out. It mimicked a natural flu, but slowly shut down the organs. "Water," she gasped. Dominic moved with a speed that would have terrified a normal human. He grabbed a tin cup, filled it from a bucket of fresh water near the door, and returned to her side. He lifted her head, bringing the cup to her cracked lips. "Drink." Slowly. She drank greedily, water spilling down her chin. He wiped it away with his thumb, the skin-on-skin contact sending another jolt of pleasure through him. He pulled his hand back as if burned. "I have herbs," he said, his voice gruff. "For the fever." but it's going to taste vile. He went to a hidden compartment under the floorboards where he kept his emergency supplies. He pulled out a dried bundle of king's foil, a rare herb that only grew in the royal gardens. He shouldn't use it. It was a dead giveaway of his status. Commoners didn't have access to king's foil. He looked at Ellie. Her breathing was shallow, rattling in her chest. Damn the secrecy, he thought. He crushed the herb into a paste with a little water and returned to her. Open your mouth. She obeyed blindly. He fed her the paste. She gagged, her eyes flying open. They were hazel, flecked with gold. Swallow it, he commanded, his alpha tone slipping into his voice unintentionally. It wasn't a request. It was an order that bypassed her conscious mind and compelled her body to obey. She swallowed. Then she blinked, looking at him with a sudden clarity. You sounded like him. Like who? Dominic asked, his muscles tensing. The alpha, she whispered, but stronger. You're hallucinating, Dominic said dismissively. Go to sleep, Ellie. He moved to the single wooden chair in the corner, sitting in the shadows where he could watch the door and watch her. Hours passed. The storm raged outside, but inside, the only sound was the crackle of the fire and Ellie's breathing. The herbs were working. Her breathing was deepening, becoming more rhythmic. Dominic didn't sleep. He couldn't. He was calculating. Mark Thorne had rejected his mate. That meant Mark Thorne was a dead man walking. But Dominic couldn't act yet. Not until he reclaimed his throne. And now he had a liability. A beautiful, rejected mate lying on his sofa. If his enemies found out he had a mate, they wouldn't just kill him. They would use her to break him first. Suddenly, Dominic's head snapped up. His ears swiveled. Footsteps. Heavy boots crushing the wet gravel outside. Not one person. 3. They weren't moving like hikers. They were moving like hunters. Ellie stirred on the couch. Dominic? She murmured, using the name she shouldn't have known. Had he told her? Quiet, he hissed, standing up. He moved silently to the window, peering through a crack in the shutter. 3 men stood in the clearing. They wore the grey tactical gear of mercenaries, but on their shoulders, visible even in the rain, was a patch. A red dagger. The rogue hunters. But these weren't government-sanctioned hunters. These were cleaners, assassins hired to wipe out loose ends. "We know you're in there," one of the men shouted, his voice booming over the wind. "Come out, Blackwood, the game is over." Dominic's blood ran cold. They weren't looking for a rogue. They were looking for the king. Ellie sat up, clutching the blanket, her eyes wide with fear. "Blackwood?" she whispered. "Why did they call you Blackwood? That's the royal name." Dominic turned to her. The disguise was blown. There was no time for lies. "Stay down," he ordered, his voice shifting. It was no longer the rasp of a hermit. It was the thunderous command of the Alpha King. "And whatever happens, do not look them in the eye." "Who are you?" she asked, her voice trembling. Dominic reached behind the door and pulled out a broadsword he had hidden there, a blade forged of silver and steel. "I am the man who's going to kill them," he said. He didn't answer her question. He didn't have to. As he turned toward the door, his eyes began to glow a vibrant, terrifying gold, the color of the Alpha Supreme. He kicked the door open, stepping out into the storm to meet his executioners, leaving Ellie staring at the back of the man she thought was a nobody. But the twist was just beginning, because one of the mercenaries wasn't just a hunter. He was someone Ellie knew. As Dominic stepped onto the porch, a flash of lightning illuminated the lead hunter's face. Ellie gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "Silas?" It was Dominic's trusted beta. The man who was supposed to be protecting the capital. The man Dominic trusted with his life. And he was standing there with a gun pointed straight at his king's chest. Dominic stood on the porch, the rain plastering his dark hair to his skull. The broadsword in his hand felt heavy, not because of its weight, but because of the truth it was about to spill blood for. "Silas," Dominic said, his voice struggling to remain steady against the roar of the wind. "Tell me I'm seeing things. Tell me you aren't standing there with a gun pointed at my heart." Silas, the beta who had been Dominic's right hand since childhood, didn't lower the weapon. His face, usually open and jovial, was twisted into a mask of cold pragmatism. "I can't do that, Dom. The council has voted. The monarchy is an outdated concept. We need progress. We need change." "Change?" Dominic spat, the gold in his eyes flaring brighter, illuminating the rain droplets around him like sparks. "You mean you need power? You sold me out to the rogue factions, to Mark Thorne." Silas flinched slightly at the mention of Mark, confirming Dominic's suspicion. "Mark is a visionary. He knows that strength should rule, not bloodlines. You were always too soft, Dominic, too obsessed with treaties and peace. We're wolves. We're meant to hunt." "Then hunt me," Dominic snarled. "If you can." Inside the cabin, Ellie pressed her back against the rough log wall, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. The Alpha King, the man who had fed her herb paste and carried her from the rain, was the Alpha King. And the man outside, Silas, was the beta of the Royal Guard. She had seen him once, years ago, during a grand tour of the territories. He had been smiling then, shaking hands. Now he looked like a reaper. "Take him!" Silas ordered the two mercenaries flanking him. The two men dropped their rifles and shifted. The sound of bones cracking and reshaping filled the clearing, sickening and wet. Within seconds, two massive grey wolves stood where the men had been, snarling, their lips curled back to reveal yellowed fangs. They weren't purebreds. They were jagged, scarred things, rogues who had lost their humanity long ago. They lunged. Dominic didn't shift. He couldn't. His wolf was strong, but his body was still recovering from the poison that had nearly killed him 6 months ago during the first coup attempt. If he shifted now, he might not be able to shift back. He met the first wolf with the flat of his blade, swinging the heavy silver sword with a speed that defied physics. The metal connected with the wolf's skull with a sickening crunch, sending the beast flying off the porch and into the mud. The second wolf fainted low, aiming for Dominic's femoral artery. Dominic pivoted, his boots sliding on the wet wood, and drove the sword downward. The beast yelped, a high, piercing sound, before collapsing, pinned to the porch floorboards. "Still the best swordsman in the kingdom," Silas noted, his voice devoid of emotion. He raised his handgun. "But you can't parry a bullet, Dom." Ellie saw the finger tighten on the trigger. She didn't think. She didn't calculate. The fever burned in her brain, making reality feel like a lucid dream. She grabbed the heavy cast-iron poker from the fireplace. It was hot, searing her palm, but she didn't let go. With a scream that tore her throat, she scrambled to the window. The shutter was cracked open. She shoved the poker through the gap and hurled it outward with every ounce of strength she possessed. It was a clumsy throw, fueled by desperation. The iron rod spun through the air and struck Silas square in the shoulder. It wasn't a lethal blow, but the shock of it, the heat of the iron, and the sheer unexpectedness made Silas jerk. The gun went off. Bang! The bullet missed Dominic's heart, tearing instead through the meat of his left bicep. Dominic roared, not in pain, but in fury. He seized the distraction. He leaped off the porch, covering the distance between him and Silas in a single bound. He didn't use the sword. He used his fist, slamming it into Silas's jaw with enough force to shatter bone. Silas crumbled, the gun skittering away into the dark underbrush. Dominic stood over him, chest heaving, blood streaming from his arm to mix with the rain. He grabbed Silas by the tactical vest and hauled him up. "Why?" Dominic demanded, shaking him. "We were brothers." Silas spat blood and a tooth onto Dominic's chest. He grinned, a bloody, broken thing. "Because she's real, Dom. The prophecy. The White Wolf. Mark found her. He's going to breed a new lineage. You're just history." Dominic froze. The White Wolf? A myth. A bedtime story about a wolf capable of uniting all bloodlines. "Where is she?" Dominic growled, tightening his grip on Silas's throat. "Closer than you think," Silas wheezed. Then his eyes shifted to the cabin, to the window where Ellie was watching, trembling. Dominic followed his gaze. The realization hit him like a freight train. Ellie, the lilac scent, the ozone, the immediate overpowering bond. She wasn't just his mate. She was the White Wolf. But she had said she had no wolf. Mark had rejected her because she was wolfless. "You didn't know?" Silas laughed, a gurgling sound. "Mark rejected her to break her spirit, to make her vulnerable, to make her run right into our trap. We tracked her here. We didn't just find you, Dom. We found the package." Rage, pure and white-hot, flooded Dominic's system. They had hunted her. They had tortured her psychologically, and they had used her to find him. "You will never touch her," Dominic whispered. He raised his fist to finish it, to end Silas's miserable life. "Do it!" Silas screamed. "And the tracker in my vest sends the signal. 100 soldiers will descend on this woods in 10 minutes. Kill me, and you doom her." Dominic froze. He looked at Ellie, pale and swaying in the window. He looked at his own bleeding arm. He looked at the dead wolves on the porch. He couldn't fight an army, not like this, not with her sick. He dropped Silas into the mud. "If I see you again," Dominic promised, his voice low and vibrating with alpha power, "I will rip your heart out and eat it while it still beats." He turned and sprinted back to the porch, leaping over the carcass of the rogue wolf. He burst into the cabin. Ellie was slumped against the wall, the adrenaline fading, the fever returning with a vengeance. "We have to go," Dominic said, grabbing his pack from the corner and shoving the medical supplies into it. He kicked the fire, extinguishing the light. "Where?" Ellie whispered. I can't walk." "I know," Dominic said. He scooped her up into his arms, ignoring the agony in his shot arm. He held her tight against his chest, shielding her from the cold. "Hold on to me, Ellie, and don't let go." He kicked the back door open and ran into the darkness of the forest, leaving the cabin and his former life behind. The forest was a living nightmare of shadows and obstacles. The storm had turned the ground into a slick trap, waiting to snap an ankle or swallow a boot. Dominic didn't slow down. He moved with a predator's grace, navigating the roots and rocks by instinct and enhanced night vision. Ellie was a dead weight in his arms, her heat radiating through his soaking wet shirt. She was drifting in and out of consciousness, mumbling names and fragments of memories. "Mark, please don't," she whimpered. Dominic's jaw tightened. Every time she said that traitor's name, he felt a fresh spike of murderous intent. He adjusted his grip, pulling her higher. His left arm was throbbing, the bullet wound burning like a brand, but the physical pain was a grounding anchor. It kept him focused. They had been running for 2 hours. Silas would have called in the cavalry by now. Drones would be up soon, scanning for heat signatures. "We need cover," Dominic muttered to himself. Underground. He knew these woods. He had spent his childhood hunting in the Blackwood territory before the burden of the crown confined him to the capital. There was a system of limestone caves to the north, near the Thunder Gorge. The minerals in the rock interfered with thermal scanners. He pushed harder, his lungs burning. Ellie stirred, her head lifting off his shoulder. "Put me down," she rasped. You're bleeding." "I'm fine," Dominic grunted. "You're not," she argued weakly. She reached out, her hand touching the tear in his sleeve where the blood was sticky and wet. "You're hurt because of me." "I'm hurt because my best friend decided to stab me in the back," Dominic corrected. "You saved my life back there, with the poker." "I missed," she whispered. "You distracted him." That was enough. He felt her shiver, a violent tremor that shook her whole frame. "Cold," she murmured. "I know. Almost there." They reached the gorge 20 minutes later. The sound of rushing water was deafening. A waterfall cascaded down a 100-foot drop, masking their scent and their sound. Dominic navigated a narrow, treacherous ledge that hugged the cliff face. One slip and they would plummet into the churning black water below. He pressed Ellie against the rock wall, shielding her with his body as he shimmied along the ledge. Finally he found it, a fissure in the rock face, barely wide enough for a man to squeeze through. He pushed inside. The air was cool and damp, but dry. The cave opened up into a small chamber, the floor covered in soft, sandy dirt. Dominic collapsed, his legs finally giving out. He slid down the wall, settling Ellie into his lap. It was pitch black, but his wolf eyes adjusted, seeing everything in shades of grey. "Are we safe?" Ellie asked, her voice small in the echoing dark. "For now," Dominic said. He leaned his head back against the stone, closing his eyes for a second. "They won't find us here tonight." He felt Ellie shift. She was trying to sit up. "Stay still," he commanded gently. "Your arm," she insisted. "I can smell the infection starting. The bullet. Is it still in there?" Dominic looked down at his arm. "Passed through. Clean exit. But it needs cleaning." "I can do it," Ellie said. She sounded stronger now, the fear replaced by a strange determination. "I helped the healers in the Silver Moon pack. Before they kicked me out." Dominic hesitated. He was the Alpha King. He didn't let people take care of him. He took care of the kingdom. But he was fading. The blood loss, combined with the poison from months ago that still lingered in his system, was taking its toll. In the pack, he pointed to the bag he had dropped. Whiskey and a lighter. Ellie crawled off his lap. She moved shakily, but her hands were steady as she rummaged through the bag. She found the lighter and flicked it on, the small flame casting dancing shadows on the cave walls. She looked at him then, really looked at him. The rugged hermit disguise was gone. In the flickering light, with the blood and the intensity in his eyes, he looked every inch the warrior king. "Dominic Blackwood," she whispered. "Everyone thought you were dead." "I was close," he admitted. He watched her tear a strip from her own cardigan, the dry part from the inside. "Why hide?" she asked, uncapping the whiskey. "Why not rally the loyal packs?" "Because I didn't know who was loyal," Dominic hissed as she poured the alcohol over his wound. The pain was blinding, white-hot. He gripped his knees, his knuckles turning white. Ellie didn't flinch. She worked quickly, cleaning the wound. "Silas, he said something about a white wolf." Dominic went still. "He thinks it's you, Ellie." Ellie froze, the cloth hovering over his arm. "Me? That's impossible. I don't even have a wolf. That's why Mark rejected me. I'm defective. I'm nothing." "You are not nothing," Dominic said fiercely. He reached out with his good hand, cupping her chin and forcing her to look at him. "You are my mate." The words hung in the air, heavier than the stone surrounding them. Ellie's breath hitched. "No," she shook her head, pulling back. "No, don't say that. The bond." It's a mistake. I can't be an alpha's mate. I'm weak. I'm sick. I'll only get you killed." "It's too late for that." Dominic gave a dry, humorless chuckle. "They're already trying to kill me. You're just the bonus prize." "I'm serious." Tears welled in her eyes. "Mark threw me away like garbage. My own parents didn't stop him. If I really was this white wolf, wouldn't I know? Wouldn't I be strong?" "Power manifests in different ways," Dominic said softly. "And sometimes it hides until it's needed." He looked at her, his thumb brushing away a tear that fell down her cheek. The skin contact sent that same electric jolt through him, stronger now. He could feel her pain, her fever, and her fear, and beneath it all, he could feel a dormant power deep inside her, like a sleeping dragon. Silas was right. She was special. "We rest tonight," Dominic said, his voice leaving no room for argument. "Tomorrow we move deeper into the wildlands. There is an old watchtower on the northern ridge. If we can reach it, I can send a coded signal to the few commanders I know I can trust." "And if we don't make it?" Ellie asked softly. Dominic leaned forward, his forehead resting against hers. He breathed in her scent, lilac, rain, and fear. "Then we die together," he whispered. "Pack of two." He pulled her close, wrapping his good arm around her. She didn't resist. She curled into him, shivering. Dominic kept watch, his eyes fixed on the cave entrance, his mind racing. He had a broken kingdom, a treacherous best friend, and a mate who didn't believe in herself. The odds were impossible. But as Ellie's breathing evened out against his chest, Dominic felt a surge of something he hadn't felt in 6 months. Hope. He wasn't fighting for a crown anymore. He was fighting for her, and God help anyone who stood in his way. Dawn broke over the Thunder Gorge, painting the grey limestone with streaks of violent orange and bruised purple. Inside the fissure, the air was still and cold. Ellie woke with a gasp, her body jerking upright. The fever had broken. The oppressive heat that had been boiling her blood was gone, replaced by a hollow, aching weakness. She blinked, her eyes adjusting to the dim light. Dominic was gone. Panic, sharp and immediate, seized her. Had he left? Had the king realized the burden of dragging a sick, wolfless girl was too great? "Drink," a voice rumbled from the shadows near the entrance. Ellie jumped. Dominic was sitting there, cleaning his sword with a rag. He looked worse than he had the night before. His skin was pallid, the stubble on his jaw darker against the unhealthy grey of his complexion. His left arm was bound tight with the strip of her cardigan, but fresh blood had already soaked through the fabric. He tossed a plastic canteen to her. She caught it, fumbling slightly. "You stayed," she said, her voice raspy. "I don't abandon my pack," Dominic replied, sheathing the blade. "How do you feel?" "Like I've been run over by a truck, but the fire is gone." "Good. We move in 10 minutes." He stood up, swaying slightly. Ellie saw it, the tremor in his legs. The Alpha King was running on fumes, the wolfbane poison from months ago, combined with the bullet wound and the exhaustion, was eating him alive. He wasn't invincible. He was dying. "Dominic," she said, scrambling to her feet. Her legs felt like jelly, but she forced them to hold her weight. "Let me look at your arm." "There's no time." "Make time," she snapped, surprising herself. "You can barely stand. You're not going to carry me today. I'm walking, but I need you upright to lead the way." Dominic looked at her, his steel eyes narrowing. Then a ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Bossy, I like it." He sat back down. Ellie unwrapped the bandage. The wound was angry, the edges red and inflamed. It wasn't healing as fast as a wolf's wound should. "Your healing factor," she murmured. It's suppressed. The old poison, Dominic admitted. It attacks the wolf spirit. My wolf is quiet. Too quiet. Ellie placed her hand over the wound. She didn't know what she was doing. She wasn't a healer. She had just washed bandages for the pack infirmary. But as her palm hovered over the torn flesh, she felt a strange sensation in her chest. A hum. A vibration that traveled down her arm and into her fingertips. Dominic inhaled sharply. "What?" She pulled back. "Did I hurt you?" "No." He stared at her, his eyes wide. "It felt cool, like ice water on a burn. Do it again." She hesitated, then placed her hand back. She closed her eyes, focusing on that hum. She imagined pulling the heat, the infection, out of him. For a minute, there was silence in the cave. When Ellie opened her eyes, the angry redness around the wound had faded to a dull pink. The bleeding had stopped. Dominic looked at his arm, then at her. The expression on his face was one of awe and terror. "You have no wolf," he whispered, "yet you just performed a spirit healing. That hasn't been seen in a century." I don't know how I did that," Ellie stammered, looking at her own hands as if they belonged to a stranger. "The white wolf," Dominic said, the conviction in his voice terrifying her. Silas was right. You are the conduit. You don't shift because your power isn't physical, Ellie. It's spiritual. You are the balance. He stood up, energized, the tremor in his legs gone. He grabbed her shoulders. "Do you understand what this means? Mark rejected you because he thought you were empty. He didn't realize he was holding a vessel of pure power. If he gets his hands on you, he will drain you dry to fuel his army." "Then we have to keep moving," Ellie said, fear lending her strength. They left the cave, stepping out onto the narrow ledge. The wind howled up from the gorge, tearing at their clothes. The trek through the wild lands was brutal. This was no longer pack territory. This was the lawless zone between borders. The trees were twisted, the undergrowth thick with thorns. Dominic led the way, hacking through the brush with his sword. He taught her as they walked, his voice low and constant, keeping her focused. "Watch the moss," he instructed. "Black moss means unstable ground. Step on the roots." "If a rogue attacks," he said later, handing her a jagged hunting knife he had pulled from his boot, "don't go for the chest. Their bone density is too high. Go for the eyes or the throat. Sever the windpipe." "I've never hurt anyone," Ellie said, gripping the handle until her knuckles turned white. "You will," Dominic said grimly. "In this world, innocence is a fatality." By mid-afternoon, they reached the base of the northern ridge. The old watchtower stood at the summit, a skeletal structure of rusted iron and crumbling stone, a relic from the Great War. "Almost there," Dominic breathed, wiping sweat from his brow. But as they began the ascent, Ellie stopped. A sudden wave of nausea hit her. Not sickness, wrongness. "Wait," she whispered. Dominic froze instantly. "What is it?" "Silence," she said. "The birds, the wind, everything just stopped." Dominic scanned the tree line. His senses were duller than usual, but he trusted hers now. He sniffed the air. Nothing but pine and decay. "I don't smell anything," he said. "That's the problem," Ellie said, backing up. "It's too clean." Someone masked their scent. Before Dominic could react, a twig snapped. Not behind them, above them. Dominic looked up just as a net, weighted with lead balls, dropped from the canopy. "Move!" he roared, shoving Ellie hard to the side. She tumbled down the slope, rolling into a patch of ferns. The net crashed down on Dominic, the heavy weights wrapping around his limbs, pinning him to the forest floor. "Dominic!" Ellie screamed, scrambling to her knees. "Run!" Dominic bellowed, struggling against the mesh. "Ellie, run!" But she didn't run. She couldn't, because emerging from the trees, walking casually as if he were strolling through a park, was a man in a pristine charcoal suit. His hair was slicked back, his smile dazzling and cruel. "Hello, darling," Mark Thorne said. Ellie froze. The sight of Mark paralyzed her. For years she had loved him. She had cooked for him, organized his schedule, comforted him when the pack politics overwhelmed him. And he had looked at her with those same blue eyes when he told her she was garbage and threw her out into the rain. "Mark," she breathed. "You look terrible," Mark said, wrinkling his nose as he looked at her muddy clothes and matted hair. "Though I suppose the rogue lifestyle doesn't come with a vanity." "Get away from her," Dominic roared. He had managed to cut one of the ropes with his hidden knife, but two men in tactical gear, Silver Moon enforcers, jumped him, hitting him with electric cattle prods. Dominic convulsed, his roar turning into a pained grunt, but he didn't stop fighting. "Ah, the king," Mark sneered, looking down at Dominic. "Look at you, wallowing in the mud. Silas told me you were pathetic, but this exceeds my expectations." "Silas is a traitor," Dominic snarled, his eyes glowing gold even as the electricity coursed through him. "And you are a usurper." "I am a visionary." Mark stepped closer to Ellie. He didn't touch her. He just inhaled her scent. "And I made a mistake, Ellie. I admit it. I threw away the scabbard, not realizing it held the sword." "I'm not a sword," Ellie said, her voice trembling. She gripped the knife Dominic had given her behind her back. "No," Mark agreed. "You're a battery, a source, the white wolf. Do you know what I can do with you? With your bloodline mixed with mine? We will create a dynasty of gods." "I would rather die," Ellie spat. "Dramatic," Mark sighed, "but unnecessary." He snapped his fingers. From the trees, another figure emerged. It was Silas, his arm in a sling, his face bruised from Dominic's punch. He was holding a remote detonator. "The tower," Silas said, pointing up at the structure they had been trying to reach. "It's rigged, and so is the ground beneath your king." Dominic stopped struggling. He looked at Silas, then at Ellie. "Let her go," Dominic said, his voice deadly calm. "You want me. I'm the threat to your rule. Let her walk away, and I surrender." "No!" Ellie screamed. "Dominic, no!" Mark laughed. "A noble offer. But you misunderstand the leverage, Blackwood. I don't care about you. You're a relic. She is the future." Mark turned to Ellie, extending a hand. "Come with me, Ellie, willingly, and I will let him live. I'll let him crawl back into his hole and rot. But if you fight me, Silas blows his legs off right now." Ellie looked at Dominic. The enforcers had their boots on his neck. Silas's thumb was hovering over the button. Dominic's eyes were pleading with her, not to save him, but to run. To save herself. "Pack of two," he had said. If she ran, they killed him. If she fought, they killed him. There was only one choice. Ellie loosened her grip on the knife behind her back. She let it drop into the ferns. "I'll go with you," she said, her voice dead. "Ellie, don't you dare!" Dominic shouted, struggling against the boot on his throat. "He will destroy you!" "It's my choice," she said, tears streaming down her face. She looked at Dominic, trying to convey everything she couldn't say with her eyes. "I love you. I'm sorry." She walked toward Mark. Mark smiled, a triumphant, hungry look. He grabbed her arm, hard, possessive. Smart girl. He dragged her toward a waiting black SUV that was parked on a logging road nearby, flanked by more armed guards. "What about him?" Silas asked, nodding at Dominic. Mark paused at the car door. He looked back at the Alpha King, pinned in the mud. kill him," Mark said casually. "Loose ends are messy." "No," Ellie screamed, thrashing in Mark's grip. You promised you'd let him live." "I lied," Mark whispered in her ear. "Welcome back to the real world, sweetheart." Ellie watched in horror as Silas turned to Dominic, a cruel smile on his face. He raised a handgun, aiming it between Dominic's eyes. Dominic locked eyes with Ellie. He didn't look afraid. He looked furious, and he mouthed one word: "Fight." Bang! The gunshot echoed through the mountains, causing a flock of crows to scatter from the pines. Ellie's scream was cut short as Mark shoved her into the car and slammed the door. The vehicle tore off, tires spinning in the mud, carrying her away from the only man who had ever truly seen her. Back in the clearing, the smoke cleared. Silas lowered the gun. He looked down at the body. But the body wasn't there. The net was shredded. The mud was churned. There was blood, a lot of it, pooling on the leaves. But Dominic Blackwood was gone. Silas's face went pale. He tapped his earpiece. "Perimeter check. Now. He's loose." "Sir," a voice crackled in his ear, trembling. "We found the perimeter squad. They're in pieces." A low, guttural growl vibrated from the dense thicket behind Silas. It didn't sound like a man. It didn't even sound like a wolf. It sounded like a monster that had just decided to stop holding back. Dominic hadn't shifted in 6 months. He hadn't been able to. But grief and rage are powerful catalysts. And the king had finally returned. The journey to the Silver Moon stronghold felt endless. Ellie sat beside Mark Thorne, her hands zip-tied, the silence in the black SUV only broken by the villain's triumphant humming. Mark was high on victory. He had the Alpha King dead and the legendary White Wolf, the power he craved, in his grasp. They arrived at the Silver Moon pack house, a cold glass fortress where Ellie was swiftly locked into a reinforced guest room. Mark had given her a silk dress and an hour to prepare for the forced mating ceremony, a ritual designed to steal her latent power. Ellie ignored the dress. She paced, her heart a drumbeat of pure rage. She knew Dominic was not dead. The mate bond, even stretched and muted by distance and trauma, still hummed. A promise of life, not loss. She focused on the feeling deep inside her chest, the unexpected power that had healed Dominic's wound and defied Mark's cruelties. She pulled on it, nurturing the spark of the White Wolf, channeling her despair into a weapon. The silence broke, not with a knock, but with the screaming of the perimeter siren. The lights flickered and died, plunging the mansion into immediate darkness. Gunfire erupted, followed by screams, and finally, a sound that froze the blood of every guard. A roar of pure, unadulterated, feral dominance. It was the sound of the Alpha King, returned from the grave. The door to her room burst inward. Not Mark, but Trent, the nervous Beta. "We have to move you. He's tearing the perimeter apart. He took the gate off. I'm not moving," Ellie said, her voice dangerously calm. Trent lunged for her arm, but a massive shadow filled the doorway. Dominic Blackwood stood there, his clothes shredded, covered in mud and blood. The bullet wound was gone, healed by the frenzy of his shift. His eyes burned with terrifying gold light, fueled by the conviction that his mate was in danger. Trent whimpered, falling to his knees and instantly submitting to the king's crushing aura. "Leave," Dominic commanded. Trent scrambled away, leaving Ellie rushing into Dominic's arms. He crushed her against his chest, the raw, visceral relief of finding her safe momentarily overriding his rage. "He missed," Dominic murmured against her hair. "I refuse to die. We finish this. Now." They moved as one unit towards the central ritual chamber. The room was lit by emergency red lamps, casting long, menacing shadows. Mark stood at the altar, Silas at his side, flanked by a dozen heavily armed guards. Dominic kicked the doors open. "Surrender, Mark," Dominic said, stepping forward, his body shielding Ellie. "It's over," Mark sneered. "It's only over when I say it is, Blackwood." He snapped his fingers. Silas moved, fast and desperate. He yanked Ellie from Dominic's protection, pressing a large dagger to her throat. "Drop the weapon, Dom, or I kill her!" Silas screamed, his voice strained with panic. Dominic froze, his eyes locked on the single drop of blood beading on Ellie's skin. He was trapped. He slowly dropped the handgun and sank to his knees in surrender. Mark laughed, an ugly, triumphant sound. He kicked the prone king in the chest. "Look at the great Alpha King, defeated by sentiment." He signaled his guards. "Beat him! I want him awake to watch the ceremony." The guards descended, boots and rifle butts raining down on Dominic. He endured the agony, not fighting back, his eyes locked on Ellie, silently pleading with her to run. Ellie watched the man who loved her sacrifice himself. The pain she felt was beyond physical. It was the despair of their linked souls. "No," the thought hammered in her mind. "I am not a weakness." She felt the humming inside her erupt. It was no longer a gentle warmth. It was a volcanic explosion of pure spirit. The red lights in the room popped, and the air around her began to vibrate. "Stop!" Ellie commanded. The sound that left her lips wasn't human. It was the primal, inescapable voice of the white wolf. It slammed into the guards and Silas, freezing their muscles and short-circuiting their alpha programming. The men collapsed, whimpering, pressing their faces to the floor in immediate, involuntary submission. Silas screamed as the force threw him against the wall. Mark stumbled back, horrified, dropping the ceremonial dagger. "What are you?" Ellie advanced, her eyes glowing white, radiating an energy that made the very floor tremble. "You rejected me because I had no wolf. You were wrong, Mark. I don't have a wolf. I am the wolf." Mark, terrified and defeated, tried to raise his hand. Dominic, bloody but galvanized, was instantly on his feet. He caught Mark's wrist and twisted, snapping the bone. He forced the whimpering alpha to his knees before Ellie. "He is yours," Ellie said, the power receding, leaving her exhausted but triumphant. Dominic met her gaze, his own eyes burning with ferocious love. He grabbed Mark Thorne by the neck. He didn't speak. He simply snapped the tyrant's neck. The Silver Moon pack house fell silent. Dominic caught Ellie as her legs gave out, holding her tightly. "The war is over, my queen," he whispered. Ellie stood on the balcony of the restored royal palace, the scent of lilac from the gardens mingling with the fresh mountain air. She wore the silver crown, no longer just a mate, but the co-ruler, the White Queen. Dominic, the wounds of war gone, joined her. He wrapped his arms around her waist, gazing at the future stretching out before them. "The council is waiting," he murmured. "Let them wait 5 minutes," Ellie smiled, leaning back into the powerful body of the man who had risked everything for her. "I was just thinking about the storm. I was so sick, so alone." "You were never broken, Ellie," Dominic said, kissing her forehead. "You just hadn't found your power yet." He turned her to face him, the bond between them, a tangible, unbreakable shield. "Ready to go rule the world?" he asked. Ellie Vance, the girl who had begged for one night of shelter, took the hand of the Alpha King. "I was born ready," she affirmed. Wow. I still get chills thinking about that scene in the ritual chamber. From a rejected outcast dying in the rain, to the White Queen commanding an entire room of soldiers to kneel, Ellie's journey is the ultimate revenge story. But I have to ask you guys, do you think Mark got off too easy? A quick death seems like a mercy, after everything he did to her. And what about Silas? Should Dominic have forgiven his best friend? Or was the betrayal too deep? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one. If you enjoyed this story of hidden identities, fated mates, and ruthless justice, please smash that like button. It really helps the channel grow. And if you haven't already, hit subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss a new story. We have a dark mafia romance coming up next week that you do not want to miss. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next video.